Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. It's our tricky job to keep you awake after lunch with the very exciting topic of reporting. So, I'm a bit of a geek. I really like reporting systems, but I've also been on the end of having to carry out reporting, so I also know that it's not the most exciting task to carry out. However, it is very important, and we're going to talk a little bit about that today, and we're going to do our best to involve you in the discussion. So I'll be asking questions of our panelists here, but I'll also be asking questions of you. So just keep that in mind, and please feel free to raise your hand if you have an answer, and we'll get going. So, a quick round of introductions here. My name is Shauna Matkovich, and I'm the founder of the Forest Link, where I provide advisory and consulting services to both forest companies and investors to realize highly impactful forest investments in the tropics. I'll pass it over to Alexandra.
Yeah. Hi, everybody. Alexandra Holmlund. I'm here in the capacity of the Swedish University of Agricultural Scientist. I'm doing research on biodiversity credit. Through this research, I have come in touch with the problematics of reporting.
All right. Hello. I'm Tuomo Kaurunen, president of Arbonaut Limited. And Arbonaut is a forest intelligence company with about 60 employees of 20 different nationalities. And what we do is we measure forests, mostly for governmental customers and in large scale using a variety of technologies from space to field measurement, but often focusing on LiDAR, airborne laser scanning activity. And like we operate in about 20 or 30 countries, despite our smallish size, and customers are governmental forest ministries or forest agencies in Finland, Scotland, Vietnam, Pakistan, Zambia, for example. But then another side of the company's activities is REDD+ jurisdictional level projects, and I think this is what is going to be more relevant today. So we advise governments about the national forest monitoring practices, reporting to UNFCCC and the World Bank. And we've done that recently in countries like Nigeria, Pakistan, Nepal, Uganda. And in Uganda, as a kind of a bright example of an exception, maybe a future trend is also that we have a privately funded project by Velux, by the window maker, basically with the aim of neutralizing their entire history of carbon emissions, 100 years. So that means like setting aside, with good, responsible management, substantial part of forest in alignment with both the national government, but obviously also the local communities. And that's what particularly topical, I think, in our discussion today.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you. So you mentioned some reporting requirements to different multilaterals and public bodies. And Alexandra, I think you'll talk about reporting with respect to a private bank that you've been in discussions with. So I think one of the key kind of questions to keep in mind is, who are we reporting for? So there's different elements to reporting. This is, of course, investor requirements, and we heard earlier on a panel earlier today about the different language often being spoken between the project developer and the investor, capturing data on the wrong things, not the things that the investors are actually interested in. So with that, I'll kind of give it over to Alexandra to kind of explain where she kind of faced this head on in the development of the biodiversity credit research.
Yeah, right, thank you. So I'm working with a Swedish bank who is supporting our research. And they have asked me in one of the latest meetings where they actually promised to buy the pilot credits. They said, okay, so what KPIs can you report on? And I was like, I think around 50 different KPIs. Would that be okay with you? And they were like, no, we just need 3. And for me, maybe for you guys, it's of course they don't need 50. But for me, the panic started. And how do I translate the complexities of biodiversity, different aspects of biodiversity, which as a researcher, there are many things that we can and do measure. How do I boil that down to something that a bank can understand and is interested in reporting? And they don't know what it is, and I don't know what it is. So, the discussion continues. But three KPIs, that's what we have to figure out.
So can I ask you then, and I'll ask you later so you can prepare, and I'll ask all of you as well, what 3 KPIs did you present to them, or what are you thinking to present?
Yeah, so eventually, after a lot of thinking and scratching of heads, we discussed that, okay, so this is connected to the methodology that I have developed. So we're considering on reporting on the hectares that are protected, the hectare area of the forest that is protected, the area of the forest that is regenerated or restored, and on those 2 variables also to add a change in biodiversity, if we can show the net gain of biodiversity over time. So those 3, I think, hopefully will be something that they can report on. But we're not ready yet. We'll see what they say.
And do you disagree, agree, have anything to add to that, Tuomo?
I hope so. There's something to add. But first, I'd like to somehow sum up what I've learned over these 2 days over here as the key motivation of what we're doing. I mean, we are dealing with biodiversity, which isn't quantified in a financial sense yet. You could almost say not at all. And yet, like we heard from the Manulife presentation recently, yesterday, that okay, you need like a big fund at least needs to optimize returns. And for that, it needs numbers which are in some currency. And so in order to get, let's say, beyond the reputational benefit of having, let's say, biodiversity preserved on your investments, to the point when we can point objectively to a return on investment on biodiversity, this is where these 3 KPIs and the very mission that you came on your first panel, Alexandra, was that, okay, it has to be concrete, objective, and somehow like consistent over time. And that means packaging. So your 50 indicators would have to be packaged. And here would be my 3 favorites right now. Hectares, yes, definitely. I mean, that's one of the key quantities that we mostly can always agree on. How many hectares have been somehow restored, reforested, benefited from the scheme. Then what I'd like to think that we could try to sum up those ecosystem-related indicators into some kind of a summary ecosystem index. But it would have to be a metric, not just like tick box kind of that, okay, this is like, what current standard, FSC and PFC do, okay, tick boxes and say, okay, we've passed on all of these. We need to give it a positive numerical value. I'm a mathematician by training, so. And that simply means that somehow come to an agreement that how they are being added up and how they are supposed to behave over history. And then where that involves, for example, the dimension change, yes, I would definitely agree with that. And then something I really valuable I learned yesterday, the Naturemetrics company, Stephanie's presentation on that okay, we could actually quantify biodiversity and biodiversity change also simply by the number of species present in a soil sample or water sample, again, appropriately sampled over the area of interest. So those 3 would be my my key. But then I want to add one important caveat, and this sort of relates to this old wisdom that, in order to make traffic safer, you shouldn't build safer cars. You should insert 6-inch nails into the steering column. Think about it for a while. So for ecological risk mitigation, we need the risk of losing your entire asset if forest fire, bark beetle infestation hits you. To promote you to insure, and that insurance premium or whatever would be then used to build up resources for mitigation activities. That somehow we would, in that way, help crucially the permanence of those credits. So mine 3+ is there.
Excellent. And I mean, I think I might also add that, so I think your biodiversity credit system as it is now, you're working on an annual basis based on hectares. And so when you look at an area that's restored over that year, and then tying in your risk element, you know, in 5 years' time, is that still maintaining those characteristics of that restored forest? So I guess I'd be curious to know, and maybe this is a diversion a bit from the reporting, but you report kind of your annual progress on the credit. But then do you report annually for how long would be the period that you would report for?
Well, that will be that. This is another subject,
Okay.
but generally for how long the project would last for. So
Yeah.
it can be decades.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then credits are issued every year for that project, that
yeah.
same project.
Yeah.
Okay. I'd like to ask the audience now if you have any experience in working with biodiversity reporting, either to kind of multinationals, to investors, or as a project developer for your own internal management. If anyone could kind of add anything to what we've discussed. Yes, over here.
We're developing, we're trying to use bioacoustics, and it's still not there. Like, we're trying to, and the big discussion is, okay, the scientists, they use bioacoustics and they want to go really detail oriented with all the bird species that are on the land. And my question is really, could we use just the noise, the variance of the noise, as a proxy for biodiversity, looking at only birds because they are on the top of the kind of the food chain? So this is one thing that I'm trying to do right now on my project.
Just to echo that, Fernando, I know people here in this room who are actually working with that, so I'm sure they will comment.
One more from the audience, and then I'll take an online question, and we can continue.
Hi, Alexandra. I'm Stephanie from Nature Metrics. Thank you for mentioning us before. So I've already had a chat with Alexandra about how to measure net gain in biodiversity. So you mentioned that you boiled this down into 3 KPIs. 2 were about hectares protected, areas protected and restored, and 1 was net gain in biodiversity. That in itself is quite a bit of pooling a lot of things together.
Yes.
And we have been working with different methodology developers, and one of the things that's coming up is, what do you pick? What aspect of biodiversity? Because, for example, the Plan Vivo methodology, they're looking at a quite comprehensive set of metrics that covers a lot, is quite ecologically meaningful and scientifically robust, but that then means that you need to survey a lot of different things, which adds costs, and therefore you might have to dilute the data resolution. So are you going for something very simple that looks at only one aspect of biodiversity, or are you trying to be comprehensive?
So the methodology, thank you, it's a great question, and I realize, what I've just said, it's very simplistic, but that's not what the methodology is like. The question I have been posed is, how do I translate the complexities of what the methodology is trying to do to a buyer that doesn't understand it really? And I mean, we can report just about anything. So, I mean, what we are trying to do is to connect the landscape level to the species level of different aspects of the biodiversity in the boreal landscape. And that's complex enough. I mean, I'm not saying, this is research. We are not ready. Things are under development. But the conversation is certainly going on how to do this in the best way. So the methodology can provide a lot of information that we probably won't report to the buyer.
Good, thank you. I'll just take a question here from online. We have Chima asking, what about local communities' livelihoods as a KPI to guarantee the project's sustainability? So if you're looking at not just biodiversity, but the entire kind of resilience of a project, how could you look at community livelihoods as a way to measure
Yeah.
that?
So I should say that the reason why I chose to work specifically with boreal Nordic forests is that I can isolate the question of biodiversity pretty well. I don't have to worry too much about the complexities of working in other geographies. So I will pass that question to somebody who can answer it better, but I do realize that it is a very important issue.
Tuomo, you mentioned that you're working in some of these geographies where community involvement is quite active.
Yeah.
Can you shed some light on that question?
Well, I thought first the same way as Alexandra said, that it helps at the moment anyway somehow to separate the issue of biodiversity from local communities' livelihoods. But obviously, the latter one is equally important, even necessary. And so I think that we have at least two possible approaches to deal with it, the southern and let's say the Nordic one. The southern one, unfortunately, may have to be the negative one, that okay, because we know that if local communities don't have a stake in the increase of value, it's very likely that they will ignore or even possibly damage the project. I mean, it's simply human behavior. I've seen it happen in concrete terms. I have friends who invested in forest in Tanzania and thought it's enough to buy land and plant. If you don't get the local communities involved, for example, in fire suppression, your forest will burn, and this is what happened. So it's like the other risks, bark beetle and forest fire, that okay, you will somehow be quite assured that this investment will not stay there unless you look after this aspect. So that's like the negative, stick side of things. The carrot side could be something that we apply actually in Nordics, both in Sweden and Finland, which is the government pays for free, open, detailed information about all properties to be collected, analyzed in a uniform way, and basically made open source, that anybody can look at anybody else's forest and what it is. So that at least creates a level playing field for both small and large players in a way, if they can access the data in this way. And they've gone quite some way in both countries in providing a public platform that allows the information also to be, something that is specifically tailored to an owner, but part of that, most of it is simply available to anybody interested. So that could help bridge this understanding gap a little bit. But I do understand it's not that trivial in the south, like given one example we
not
had
easy.
Tanzania.
Smaller control
Yeah.
in the boreal. Any more examples of biodiversity reporting? Back here, there's this woman here in the black.
Sorry, can you stand? Here. Hi, sorry.
Okay.
Thank you. I'm Kerry Marie, coming from the Cape Flora Kingdom. I manage a conservation fund out there, and we have two very basic indicators we ask from some of our recipients. Number one is your contribution towards truly safeguarding this biodiversity. And I know it might be considered unsexy, but that's a protection level that needs to be assigned to that land. It also speaks to the longevity of the project. I mean, we know paper parks exist, but if you don't have it on paper to begin with, it's not going to be there in the future. So that's an easy one. That's hectares under better protection, which are recognized internationally. And I think we've come a long way in standardizing the different protection systems in each country, and we can figure out what is considered an effective conservation protection status in whichever country you work in. And then the other one speaks to improved management of the biodiversity. And one indicator talks about species composition, and one talks about ecological condition. And there are standard tracking ways that you can measure the change. Your present ecological state, your desired ecological state, and what has the change been. You'd probably have to set those last two indicators, though, to your let's say your floristic regions. I can't imagine you're going to have a standard set that you could use globally, but at least the one you can use globally.
Thank
Thank you.
you. Anybody else have anything to add on the reporting of biodiversity? Certain metrics that you're using? Otherwise, I'll shift gears here a little bit to requirements. So we've talked earlier a bit about different regulations that are coming in. The task force on nature-related financial disclosures is coming in. Companies are going to be needing to report on their nature footprint, basically. And I'm wondering for the panelists to kind of give their thoughts on how projects on the ground, they might have their own view on what these 50 indicators might be that they're measuring and managing for. Or, in this case with the bank that you mentioned, they asked you for 3 indicators. Yeah. But maybe you have a company that's coming and saying, no, this is what we need. And it's maybe miles apart from what the project developers are actually measuring. Do you have any thoughts on how we can kind of make the ends meet, so to speak?
Well, yes, at least one, I think, very necessary step we need to take as a community soon is bridging the gap between project level, landscape level, jurisdictional level, national level reporting. And now we have, like at the moment, both the top-down and the bottom-up approach, but there's a kind of a gap in between which creates this very, very controversial kind of challenge we have. So something, I was really impressed by the ACORN methodology presented. I thought it was an ingenious idea that you focus on agroforestry, which makes your inventory process much simpler because you're likely to know the species at least. And though this idea that this has to go back to communities, but the methodology should be somehow aligned with whatever is being nationally reported. So this is like the space where I think large corporations could play an important role. I mean, they could co-finance activities that somehow do landscape level development, and one essential component would be to make sure that these indicators are aligned with whatever is nationally or mandated by UN, the FCCC or so on. So that is something I think we can, as a community, address, but it has to be done, of course, by example, so by individual projects where first we explicitly try to do this bridging. Maybe that would lead to some kind of convergence sooner or later.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, I'm thinking that, I think we are all learning at the moment, both the institutions who are in the need of reporting and us who are providing the reporting material. We're all learning about what is relevant and basically educating each other on each other's needs. I think that's the process we have to go through. And also something that just came to my mind, the European Union has very ambitious goals on protection of nature. And that is going to be something that is going to influence all of us, probably particularly forestry. And there is a lot of work that can be done and should be done, and I think might be even opening for other approaches to biodiversity protection than national reserves or national park or protected areas that are financed by taxes, and that in turn kind of results in a question: how do we work with this? What kind of frameworks do we have for this work? And what is important? What is it that needs to be increased? I mean, is it just area, or is it the quality of the areas? What is it that we are wanting to protect? What is the relevance here? Yeah.
And here is maybe I want to make a kind of a public apology on behalf of Finland, and especially to Sixten, who's been very active, my partner in forest industry in the past, that we Europeans, we Finns and Swedes in particular, often like criticizing Brazil and, let's say, Bolsonaro's government that, okay, you're destroying Amazonian forests for financial gain and lawless penetration and all that. We don't realize that often that easily, that in fact we have done exactly the same as we discussed this morning, that for the last 200 years, the economy of Sweden, especially of Finland, has been built up on forest industry. And it's been done in such a way that we've resulted in this very peculiar pattern of forest. We have like standwise monocultures covering 2/3 of the land. And we've come to regard those like natural forests, which they're not. And so that we also have the same situation, just somehow higher industrial level, that our livelihoods and our well-being and our national identity depend to a certain extent of a certain kind of destruction of biodiversity in particular. And we need to, I think, acknowledge this, eat some humble pie, and then maybe the European taxonomy will force us, if we are not otherwise, kicking and yelling, but anyway, to join in and somehow find value in diverse forests as well.
Yes, thank you. And I'm just looking at a question here from online. How do you measure the net change in biodiversity that you were referring to as one of your top 3 KPIs?
Right, so that can obviously be done in different ways. We do have a certain biodiversity assessment methodology that is based on the common ways of doing biodiversity assessment in Sweden. So it's also very connected to the forest inventory process, because I'm focusing on a forest biodiversity credit. So it is done in accordance to practice, what is practiced in Sweden today. And the important thing is obviously, if you want to show a change, that you do the same thing over and over and over a period of time. But it has to be done in exactly uniform way, otherwise you get data that you cannot compare.
And I'd like to add that also credit to Sweden, because your system somehow is finding a very nice compromise between conservation need and timber production for at least larger forest owners. That is something that we've learned now in our projects in northern Sweden, that you have to set aside a certain part of your forest. You're given like hectares, but you can choose those hectares yourself that you want to conserve more. And now our business, to a large extent, is to identify those hectares where there's most bang for the buck in terms of that, like small biotopes, groups of dead trees, deciduous trees that otherwise in a rather monotonous conifer culture, so that you identify those places that you want to set aside. And then, of course, they have to be, consistent in time, as you said. So I believe that there is a way to somehow turn that into a quantification of change in biodiversity when amended with nature metrics, counting of species. Obviously we have to decide which are the relevant species, but I believe that list can be expanding and then simply looking at the time series. So you might have a metric.
But I'd like to add, we've been speaking about earlier today about innovative technologies, and there are other ways of doing it, because the methodology I'm working with is very manual still. But I am very excited about what is going on. We're talking about bioacoustics, we're talking about eDNA here, there is some satellite data that can be applied. I still do think we need ground truth, boots on the ground and measuring on the ground. But I also believe that we will be learning very, very quickly if we bring these things together. And I think we are certainly moving into that direction. So I'm really excited to see how this part of my work can be improved.
And also to add, let's say, methodological point of view, that actually what you talk about, and it was a nice comment about bioacoustics, whoever has been in a tropical forest will suddenly recognize the way that actually works, and compare that to now, even in the bloom of summer, we have sometimes nice soundscape, but in the winter, it's terribly quiet. so you realize but what technologically this means is data fusion. That we are now able to do data fusion. I spent about 10 years of my life in weather forecasting and climate prediction at ECMWF in Reading. And there the process that, okay, you take your laws of nature, mass conservation, Navier-Stokes equations, as a prior. So anything that actually makes scientific sense. And then you add to that your observations and apply machine learning at the marginal distribution, as a statistician would say, at the fringe, to complement your knowledge. And this is how we get both a very robust and stable, but also holistic view. And it allows us to incorporate new sensing in instruments in a kind of a systematic way. Let me ask a question, just this is for mathematicians' interest. How many of you know what is a Kalman filter? Good. 1, 2. Great. Okay. 3. Nice. Yeah. All right. So it's just to how to say, amuse you as well. It's a famous algorithm, one of the most famous used in the world. It's basically following a status of a system over time. Rudolf Kalman, a Californian Hungarian mathematician developed that in 1964 guide missiles. So you're getting a sense of where you're heading, and you have about 6 parameters, which are the motion parameters of a solid body in 3-dimensional space. And now we apply the same in weather forecasting and climate. We actually take a billion-dimensional space, and we apply the Kalman filter. So all the observations we get, they get like the proportional contribution, which is inversely proportional to the uncertainty of that quantity. And because you move in small local steps in time, then this sort of whole system looks relatively stable and robust. So that's like a nice pattern. So in terms of data, in terms of satellite information, bioacoustics, genetic information, eDNA, we can probably absorb much of this into this consistent framework and keep it still like not jumping around too much, because that's the one detriment, that if you don't have this stability, then your estimates of value will start bouncing around, and this is what investors hate.
Yes. Speaking to investors and any corporations in the area that are considering either attaching biodiversity to carbon credits that you're looking at, or whether you're considering getting into some kind of a biodiversity credit buy, do you have requirements yourselves that you look for in terms of biodiversity? So are there metrics that you're specifically looking for, or are you still kind of in the learning phase and want to understand what the project developers can deliver and what they are currently managing for? Crickets. Yes.
Hi, I'm Courtney at Citigroup. I think this space is really interesting, and I was at Africa Climate Week in Gabon a couple of weeks ago. There's a lot happening in the African carbon space, as we've heard a lot yesterday. What's interesting is I saw a number of presentations around platforms that would be selling forest carbon projects across Africa. And I asked the question around biodiversity co-benefits. And it was interesting because at least the African stakeholders, project sponsors, said that actually for them it's job creation that was a much bigger co-benefit in those countries. So it's interesting. I think I know you asked about biodiversity credits or co-benefits, and that's something we're certainly looking for. We think a lot of corporates will be interested in. But in the emerging market context, it's really about job creation and showing how forest protection can enhance forest livelihoods and jobs in a country like Gabon.
Thank you. Anyone have anything else to add to that? In the back.
Hi there. My name's Charlie. I work for Financial Link Securities. We're a platform matching institutional capital with projects on the ground. What I think is really important is to try and there's quite a big grey area between philanthropy for conservation projects and biodiversity credits. And what's really important is if you're going to sell a financial instrument, it needs to be very clearly defined, and there can't be any kind of grey area about a percentage of, yes, there can be a percent change, but it needs to be better defined than kind of what you're saying. And I realize that's an ongoing problem, but we need to be very clear about what it is. And the 3 KPIs that you sort of presented, the first 2 are defined, but the third one is probably not that defined. So can you elaborate a bit more? And then the other way to look at the problem might be to kind of explain the process of improving biodiversity, and maybe that would be a better way to kind of therefore value the credit and actually sell it on that basis.
Yeah, thank you, Charlie. It's a very good question, and this is you're kind of hitting the soft spot here, because this is where the complexities are really. How do you describe improvement of biodiversity? So so from what I've seen in the research I'm doing is that we are looking. Let me explain in the big picture. We're looking at the landscape level in the Swedish forest landscape. What do we see is missing? And we do know that certain habitats are becoming rarer. And therefore, we have seen the decline of certain species. So we're trying to connect the species to the landscapes. And we've said that, okay, so what we can do with the forest management today is to do things differently in order to create more of those habitats that have been depleted. So therefore, we have decided to work with conservation and restoration. So then what we can do is that we can do the biodiversity assessment at start of the project and then follow it over time. And we believe that by doing something today, let's say a restoration action, that it will lead to the actual positive development for these species that are in decline. But the fact is, the sad fact is that we actually don't know. We don't have the probabilities that will tell me that if I do this today, in 10 years I will have this development. I'm sure there is some science around that which I'm not aware of today. I haven't read all the papers there are in this world. Hopefully, in the future, we will be able to do some kind of data mining and find the results of all the ecological research that's been done that can actually give us these probabilities, because then we can make a mathematical model for a complex ecosystem that will give us a kind of a probability of something happening in a certain amount of time. So today, what we can do today is that we say, okay, so we know what's missing, and we know that certain actions might lead to a result that is desirable, but that's all we know. So that is what we can work with at this stage in time. It's a long answer, sorry.
No problem. Yes,
Yeah.
question in the front here, or comment?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Alexandra. Related to what you were saying, I'm in the consulting. I'm not an investor myself. With the biodiversity, what we have seen, especially measuring the biodiversity, we are. My feeling is that we are not granular enough. We measure. When we take a measure of biodiversity, we say how much hectare is conserved, and then inherent assumption is that if we can conserve this much hectare, assumption is that the species will remain there. And now with the eDNA, what Nature Metrics is doing, we can know how many species is there. But I think we have to go one step further. There is certain number of species there. That doesn't mean that there is enough number of each species there.
Yeah.
And then with the the bigger animals, not the microorganism I'm talking about. In the smaller scale, we can do it. In a smaller scale, we can measure manually, tell. But for the bigger scale, I think we need the help of AI and so on. If you want to know in a large area how many individual of each species is there, then manually it is just impossible. And then without knowing the population size, I think we really cannot measure what is happening with the biodiversity. Just knowing that we are conserving this much forest, that will not guarantee that species will survive.
Yeah, and I think thank you. I think it's important to discuss quality and quantity of what we're doing. Why are we protecting an area, and what do we hope to achieve? And why are we restoring? Why are we doing the restoration action, and what are we hoping to achieve? We have ecologists here present. I'm not an ecologist. I just realize that this is something that needs to be worked on, and I look at this particular space from a forester's perspective. But I do realize that from the Swedish debate, which is rather infected at the moment, we know that not all forests are equally worth protecting, because there are different values in them. But those that are very valuable should be definitely protected, and then we need to find them. And this is when then we come to these different technologies of detecting, so we need to do relevant stuff. And we need to report back that we have done the relevant stuff. That's basically the conclusion.
So let's unpack that bit about the quality and the value. In the work that you do, are you able to find opportunities of kind of high value nature restoration areas? And how would you do that?
Yeah, very much so. So this is how comes from this comprehensive perspective and data fusion of different modalities. So airborne LiDAR allows us to recognize the size of trees, also the undergrowth, and then nowadays, because the point density is high enough, we can even go down to individual tree canopy level. Now a tree canopy is actually a canopy polygon which could have one or more stems beneath it. But that means that there are like these sort of small habitats at least. And then you have clusters of those. And for example, one of those was these clusters of dead trees, that we identify individual dead trees that are still standing, and then suddenly realize that, okay, there seems to be groups of those in that area. That means there's likely to be, decaying wood on the ground, a lot of rare insects and so on. So it's increasingly becoming possible to somehow identify like an umbrella for a valuable ecosystem. Then we do need the biologists, the ecologists to go there and check those before they are set out for protection. But the area is substantially reduced at that point. Also, something else we do is like restoration of wetlands. So we can calculate from LiDAR the water balance of that even, and calculate the flow in even rather complex ditch networks. Now we have this history of draining forests, draining swamps in order to grow more trees. Sometimes it succeeded, but very often it didn't, because simply the conditions are too wet still, or the soil is too poor. So that identifies first areas which could be worth restoring into wetlands, and thereby increasing that type of biodiversity. And then also identify exactly the minimum number of points you need to block, so that minimize the concrete footprint of the excavator to cause that rewilding and rewetting. Sometimes you get really interesting controversies in this, like in Scotland, there's a simultaneous plan of restoring wetlands, but also restoring the Atlantic forest. Somebody here mentioned yesterday that technically the Western Highlands border of Scotland is actually kind of a temperate rainforest. So now which of these is the genuine original? We'll have to leave that to both the politicians and maybe scientists, but you get this kind of quite interesting phenomena and possibly like suggestions for aerial compromise. That, okay, this is where we might now regard it as a wetland, and let's restore it to peatland, and this side maybe we could try to grow some more trees and really bring back the Atlantic temperate rainforest.
Good. We're almost out of time, but I see one more question online here that I haven't answered, so I'll just raise that one here. Are credits also issued for the maintenance of biodiversity when fully recovered after the initiation of a credit period or project?
We haven't issued any credits yet.
And when you do, how do you envisage that will work?
So because the process of recovering biodiversity, it will take a lot of time, specifically in the north. They will be issued in advance, but therefore one needs to report on what is going on during that period of time, of the project period.
And can they be revoked if there's...
Well, the system we are proposing is biodiversity units per hectare and year system in order not to get there. Because then we have a shorter reporting period, and therefore the risk for the buyer and the issuer will be very small.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think there might be one interesting way to do that, which is basically coupling this permanence to the carbon credit. Now, because trees keep on growing, even in this situation, and let's say that if we ignore naturally dying trees in a mature forest, that they are not like regarded like removals of carbon, because that's like a natural phenomenon. Trees keep growing, biomass keeps growing. Beyond that, we could plug into that something that my friend and colleague Erik Dinerstein proposed about 10 years ago. He called it the wildlife premium. Now, Erik spent much of his life in Nepal protecting tigers. And he realized that the only way to compensate communities, for example, would be that, okay, there is some annual payment given for a preservation of a certain number of big cats in the area. Now, in those countries, it's actually dramatic to the point that we don't understand. The presence of leopards means that children get killed every year. You know, they simply, that's the way that they behave, and if they're around, you can't help it. But the communities are more tolerant of this sort of tragedy, and if they have something to gain, so that we could simply see that as much as carbon credits keep on piling up, then there would be like this added premium for biodiversity, wildlife conservation, whatever metrics we're able to do that, and that would create higher value returns. So maybe that could be one possible solution.
Which we're starting to see, but I think we need to get it more quantitative, don't we?
Yes, for sure.
But
3 KPIs.
yes, 3. Anyways, I think we're out of time for now, so I'd like to thank you all for your attention after lunch and for your involvement.
Yeah.